So, I think we have a visible screen. I hope the recording is still working. We're a couple minutes late, so I won't keep postponing this part. The next talk will be of Remco, one of our colleagues and interns at WarpNet, who is actually going to take a deep dive into the Microsoft world. So, big hands of applause for Remco.
Okay, let me move a little bit over here so you can actually see it. So after the technical issues, everything seems to work right now. I hope in the back you can also read the text. Yeah, so we already had some great talks today, and I hope everyone is enjoying this first edition of BSides Groningen. For the next 40 to 45 minutes, we'll be diving into Microsoft Remote Procedure Call vulnerabilities and actually how to find them yourself. Had to be turned on. Who am I? My name is Remco van der Meer. I'm currently an ethical hacker and intern at WarpNet, which is a security company located in Haren. Other than that, I'm still a student at the Hansa University of Applied Sciences, where I do a major in network and security engineering, currently in my last year. In my spare time, I like to do some capture the flag events and also do some security research, for example, in bug bounties. Yeah. And I have a particular interest in Windows security internals, so this can either be go from Active Directory.
Ja, hij doet helemaal niks.
This can go from Active Directory. Roald, your microphone is still on. So this Windows. So yeah, particular interest in Windows security. This can go from Active Directory, but also to a deeper level, for example, in MS-RPC. Before we dive into that, let me tell you a bit about the Amazon rainforest. So, as you may know, it's the biggest forest in the world. With a surface of 6.7 million square kilometers. Well, in comparison, the Netherlands is only 41,000. It is estimated that there are 400 billion trees there, but yet it is largely interconnected. And the interesting thing is that in recent years, researchers have discovered ancient cities where people used to live. And they did it using these things called LiDAR scans. And this image over there actually shows one of those images. And an example of this is a study in 2022 that revealed 25 of these interconnected cities. And what you will see in the upcoming slides, and we will do also a comparison, that MS-RPC and the Amazon rainforest are quite similar in some cases. So let's dive into what is Microsoft's Remote Procedure Call. It is a protocol that uses the client-server model, and its goal is to simplify these inter-process communication between a client and a server. Remote Procedure Call actually is not from Microsoft itself, but Microsoft took the protocol implementation and written its own version of it, and that is called MS-RPC. Yeah, and what it does, it enables a client to invoke a call on a remote service. So you can ask yourself, okay, why would you want to do that? But a use case of this is that if you have a program or you have a service in Windows that needs to have a function that is already implemented within another program or service in Windows, you could implement that whole process again or that functionality again. But what you can also do is expose its function over RPC so that the other function can call it using MS-RPC. So it does this by using this standard thing called a interface, which basically is a list of procedures that can be called. And the interface, So the interface makes use of this uniquely generated GUID, which you can recognize. And the goal is that both the client and the server operate using the same rules. And the functions that are being listed in a RPC interface are called procedures. So what is a procedure? Actually, this is the function that is being exposed over RPC. And all of the procedures have a uniquely operation number, or called opnum. And of course, a client can call these procedures. And an IDL file looks like this. So this describes the interface, and the IDL file stands for interface definition language. And you can see here that it is that uniquely generated GUID, and it has a version. So when something changes within this interface, it can become version 2.0, for example. And but what's more interesting is the procedure. So I've given 2 example procedures here, where both take one integer input parameter and have an output integer parameter. And I actually commented operation number 0 and operation number 1. So this is how the IDL file will look like. And this file goes into the Microsoft Interface Definition Language compiler, which then gives you 3 files, a header file and a stub file for both the client and the server. And the server, the RPC service, has to link this header file in order to expose its functions over RPC. And the client also has to link this file in order to make the function call. The last thing that is important for now is that once you have your client and your server, you want to be able to use a communication form of how you can make function calls. And remote procedure call has actually quite a few options for these. And this can either be using TCP, UDP, or even HTTP. But what you will see more commonly are named pipes. And these can be called from SMB. And we will dive a bit later into that of what these named pipes actually are. There's also another option. So we are now currently looking at the remote options. But there is also the option to invoke the call locally. And this is done over advanced local procedure call. So let's dive into how a call is being made. So it all begins with the client that initiates the RPC call. And the following flow is being initiated. So the client makes the function call and it sends it to its stop. And the stop packs the RPC call and sends it to the runtime. So the stop is actually kind of a proxy that handles the communication between the client and the server. And what the runtime is, this is like the underlying system that manages the network communication, the request handling and its security description. So this can be recognized in Windows as the RPC RT4 DLL. And now that we have a basic concept of what MS-RPC is, let's do a comparison, because we know that the Amazon was the biggest forest in the world. Well, MS-RPC is the biggest forest in Windows. It has 432 RPC interfaces, which include 6,845 procedures. And these, at the time of checking, this is on a Windows 11 machine with the latest current version. But yet, it is largely interconnected. And we can kind of see these vulnerabilities are like what our ancient cities are that are being discovered in the Amazon. Because MS-RPC is quite an old protocol. So let's dive into what the vulnerabilities are. So RPC calls are often being executed by a high privileged identity. So this can either be anti-authority system, which you may know, or it can be anti-authority network service. And other than that, we know that these functions are being exposed remotely. So if you find a vulnerability within those implementations, chances are that you will be able to exploit this remotely as well. So past discovered vulnerabilities allow denial of service, privilege escalation, spoofing, or even remote code execution. So let's see what the past vulnerabilities have to tell about that. So anybody heard of this vulnerability called Eternal Blue? Well, it is also not a vulnerability within MS-RPC. It's a remote code execution within SMB version 1, but it could be exploited over MS-RPC. Then we had Print Nightmare in 2021, which was a remote code execution within the printer implementation in Windows in the print spooler. Petit Potam, which is a spoofing vulnerability that is still being abused today. Zero Logon, which was a vulnerability that will allow a remote attacker to reset a machine account's password. And then we had Print-a-Bug, which is also a similar vulnerability to Petit Potam, which is a spoofing vulnerability. But the interesting thing about the Print-a-Bug exploit or vulnerability is that it did not get a CVE. So Microsoft has these things called won't fixes. And both Print-a-Bug and Petit Potam are NTLM relay factors, which you may heard somewhere or maybe used in your pen testing environment. But this is by first begins by forcing a identity to make a NTLM authentication request to your attacker system. So this is called a coerce. And Microsoft never fully made a patch for these vulnerabilities because doing so will require fundamental changes within the NTLM authentication protocol, and the services which are vulnerable to Print-a-Bug or Petit Potam simply need NTLM to work. Oh yeah, and most of these coerce vulnerabilities are classified as a moderate spoofing vulnerability. And moderate vulnerability by Microsoft means that they probably won't fix it, or maybe they will implement a fix in a future version of Windows. But currently, moderate or low vulnerabilities are not being addressed. So why did Petit Potam then get a CVE and Print-a-Bug didn't? Well, this is because Petit Potam was could actually be exploited unauthentically. And this meant that a remote attacker, unauthenticated, could force a high privilege identity to make an NTLM request to his attacker system. So now the vulnerability was actually classified as important for Microsoft, and then they implemented the fix. However, the authenticated part of Petit Potam still works today. So the Petit Potam has 14 vulnerable procedures. And if we take a look at how the IDL file for the EFS encryption file systems RPC interface looks like, you can see that opnum 1 is called EFS RPC open file raw. And this takes a input parameter, which I commented is the file name. And this is actually documented by Microsoft as how the RPC implementation works for that. So you can just look up this code and you can actually read how it works. But that's only if you're lucky, and if you're researching other implementations of MS-RPC, you will likely not find such a documentation. But the interesting thing is that it takes a file name. And if we specify a remote UNC file name path, so it says // in a remote IP address, you will see that on the remote system that you send the NTLM authentication request, that it comes in as a high privilege identity. And in this case, the RPC call was executed as anti-authority system, but of course this is not the identity that is being used to authenticate to remote systems. This is done by using the machine account that can be recognized by the $sign at the end of the username. So now that we have a basic concept of MS-RPC and its vulnerabilities, and we want to find maybe some vulnerabilities ourselves. But as we have already discussed, MS-RPC is like a forest. It has a lot of interfaces and a lot of built-in procedures. We want a way to automate this vulnerability research process. So I took a automatable approach for this, which includes a fuzzing approach. So the previous talk already did an introduction into fuzzing, so that's great. But before we can dive into that, we have to understand a little about how the Windows works in the kernel by the objects. Because as you may know, everything in Linux is a file, but in Windows everything is an object and API orientated. So to manage these objects, we have the object manager in the Windows kernel. And this is of course responsible for managing the objects. And there's also a thing called the object manager namespace. And if you run Windows or you have ever used Windows, you will likely go into your file system by opening the Windows Explorer and take a look at your file system. But under that file system lies a whole other file system called the object manager namespace. And this is actually not documented that well by Microsoft of how developers or users can access the object manager. So that makes it even more interesting. And yeah, this file system can include things like files, processes, threads, devices, or security objects. And like I said, normally you won't be able to access this quite easily. But oh yeah, so some examples of directories within that object manager file system that are interesting to us as MS-RPC security researchers are the named pipe directory. So as you may remember from one of the first slides, is a way of connecting a client to a RPC server is over named pipes, which is done over SMB. And the object manager actually stores these named files within that object manager namespace. And the same counts for the local endpoints. So this is called the RPC control, which includes the remote procedure call endpoints. Like I said, normally you won't be able to access it quite easily, but then a security researcher called James Forshaw came on and he wrote a tooling for this that allows security researchers or a user from user mode to access this namespace. And the tool itself is open source, so that's great, and you can use PowerShell to use this tooling. So, and now we have a way to interact with MS-RPC on our Windows system. And has anybody heard about this new feature called sudo for Windows? Because this also includes a MS-RPC implementation. So how this works, you will define your RPC server variable, and the target for this is located in the system32 directory, and you will pipe this to a cmdlet called getRPC server, which is then included in the NT-Object Manager PowerShell module. And if you then call this variable, you will see that the sudo binary, the sudo executable, includes a RPC interface with two procedures. So what actually is going on when you make a sudo call, you actually make a RPC call that is being used to execute your high privilege process in the background. But more importantly, it allows us to create RPC clients. So we can just parse our target, get RPC server, which is included with the NT-Object Manager. And then what we do, we parse this client to the getRPC client cmdlet. And now we have a client that starts off disconnected. So we need endpoints to connect our clients. And And the object manager also uses a background function to go into the object manager and look for the RPC endpoints that this interface exposes, so that we know, okay, I have this client and now I know how to connect to it. And in order to connect our client, we use a string binding, which is a combination of the protocol sequence together with the endpoint. So in the above example, we have two endpoints, one over named pipes and one over local advanced local procedure call. In this case, we choose the named pipe as our connection, and then you will actually see that our client is now connected. And now that we have a connected client, we can actually interact with procedures. Now we can make our procedure calls. So when we have another example of the EFS RPC open file raw procedure, which we know was one of those procedures that is vulnerable to petit potam, we can see its definition. And in this case, it takes two input parameters, where one is a string, which was likely that file name that was documented by Microsoft, and that integer, which is like a security flag. And we can use our client now to make this call. And what we do, we specify our remote host IP address, which is a UNC path, and then we specify the security flag, which is just integer 0. And if we are listening for incoming NTLM authentication request on the IP address that is listed here, we will then see again how petit potam actually works. So I get it high privilege identity NTLM authentication request. However, this process is automatable, because what we did so far is we parsed our target, so in this case the EFS service DLL, which includes the vulnerable RPC interface procedures, and we actually created a client for this, and we connected our client because the object manager knew the endpoints over which a client can connect. So let's take it for a bigger example where we take all the DLLs and all the executables from the system32 directory, and we loop over its RPC interfaces using the object manager. So now we have all those almost 500 RPC interfaces. We can then gather the RPC endpoints and their string bindings, because we will need a way of connecting our client to the RPC server over its endpoints. And then we actually create the RPC clients. Oh. So then we loop over all the RPC interfaces, their procedures, and gather their parameters. So as we knew from the previous example of the EFS RPC open file raw procedure, is that it took a string as input parameter and a integer input parameter. And now that we know the types for those parameters, we can actually generate a random value for this. And this is where the fuzzing process begins. Because we know, okay, yeah, it takes a string, and now we want to generate input for that for making that RPC call. And finally, we loop over all those procedures again, but then actually make the RPC call with our random specified input parameters. However, there is a problem, and that is that it is not very efficient in this way. Because if something goes wrong in the fuzzing process, you will need to gather all those RPC interfaces again. So we need to have some kind of solution to do a more efficient fuzzing. So what we can do, we can cut it into phases, where you have phase 1, your inventorized phase, where you gather all the RPC interfaces, all the endpoints and the binding strings, and you will export them to a JSON file. And now that you have your JSON file, you will specify that as input for your fuzzer. And if something now goes wrong within the fuzzing process, or you want to adjust how you fuzz, you don't have to go over the phase one again. You can just keep feeding those RPC connections to the fuzzer. So how I did that, I first used the get RPC server CMDLED, which is included within the object manager. And then I parse those interfaces of our target into a CMDLED called get RPC server data, which is a CMDLED that I wrote myself. And we specify the out path for our JSON file. So this JSON file looks something like this, where I again have the example of the EFS service DLL, which is vulnerable to petit potam. And it has two RPC interfaces with two endpoints, and now I have the string bindings, which I can easily use to connect my clients. And this JSON file is then being used as input for the fuzzer. And this is also now using a outpath to export the fuzzing results into JSON files. And it does this by making 3 JSON files. So when a fuzzing input was allowed, it will store it in allow.json, or if it causes an error, it will store it in the error.json file. And the third option is that we were not allowed to make that RPC call as our current user, so then it stores it in this file called deny.json, which you can then compare to other users that may have other privileges, and that will be interesting to compare those results. And the file for this looks something like this, where we again have the example for the EFS service DLL within the RPC interface that is vulnerable to petit potam, and we can actually see our phishing input. And our phishing input again includes those 2 parameters that it needs, and you can actually see one recognizable string, and it will attach this random string to it, which is generated by the fuzzer input generator. And yeah, it is also storing the output of that, what the RPC server sends back. So this can access denied, or it can also be like a Windows message that the path was not found, or that it could not be specified. However, if you make one call, this is a quite nice solution for analysis, but when your JSON file gets up to 50,000 lines or even more, I'm not going through that JSON file to look for interesting RPC interfaces. So we need a better way to analyze our results. So I thought about this, and I actually saw an interesting article about using Neo4j to do your fuzzing analysis. And what Neo4j is, it is a database solution where you can store your data in, and it will show you the relationships between your data by using cyber queries. And I also wrote a CMDLED for this as well, where we now have our fuzzing results file, and we parse that to the import data for Neo4j CMDLED, which takes 2 parameters called the Neo4j host. So this can be a local running Neo4j system, but likely it is stored somewhere in a Docker container remotely. And you also have to specify the credentials, so the Neo4j username and password, and then it will make that connection over HTTP or HTTPS and import that data into your remote or local Neo4j database. So then, when we have our data, we can now make a cyber query like this, which will show the relationship between a RPC server, its interfaces, its endpoints, the procedures, and our fuzzing input. And then you will have something like this, where we have now a nice view of what we send, and we can see easily how our fuzzing input is being related to the RPC server and its RPC interface and procedures. And using this solution, we can also easily find service crashes, because remember that we also have a file which stores our errors, and we can specify something called maybe an error that we know, okay, yeah, no, this error causes a crash, or lets us know that something crashed. And if we then map this to Neo4j, we can easily see, okay, this procedure with this input that we sent crashed a service somewhere in the background. But we can also take it a step further, because when we send something to the RPC procedure and it was allowed, okay, great, but what did it actually do in the background of the RPC service? And to get a better insight into this, we can use Process Monitor, which is a tool in the sysinternals, which you may know. And basically what it does, it monitors for processes running in the background of Windows. And using this, we could map Win32 API function calls. And using the invoke fuzzer cmdlet, we could then, for example, specify a remote IP address to a system that is listening for incoming NTLM authentication requests. For example, if we didn't know about Petit Botam, and the fuzzer goes over that EFS service that is vulnerable to Petit Botam, and it makes that function call, we will see that NTLM authentication requests coming in, because the fuzzer now has our remote IP address included within the input for the fuzzer. And to actually know where this NTLM authentication request comes from, we can specify our remote IP address within the filter of Process Monitor in the path. So now, when you have your fuzzer running while listening for calls in Process Monitor, we can see something like this. And you can see that LSAS is actually making this create file function for the EFS service DLL RPC interface. So now we know, okay, this call is actually doing a create file Win32 API function call. And we can export these results to a CSV file using Process Monitor. And we can import those into our Neo4j database. And I wrote a cmdlet for that as well. And when we now make a cyber query that will also show the relationship between our allowed fuzzing results or allowed fuzzing input, we can now see what our fuzzing input actually did in the background and at what service, and maybe as which user. And using this solution, we can, for example, find registry rights, which are interesting if you are a low-privileged user that is suddenly able to make an RPC function call that somewhere makes a write in the register of Windows. It's, of course, very interesting. And also things called high-privileged file operations. And I will dive into a bit deeper about what those are. So, using this approach, I was able to identify multiple vulnerabilities within Windows, which I reported to Microsoft. So a summary of this is multiple service crashes, multiple system crashes, so blue screen of death, which I wrote a blog about, which you can find on my blog, a $30,000 bounty, and a CVE for a vulnerability within local session manager. And I'm not allowed to talk about that just yet, but it was a very interesting bug. But the details will be released soon. And multiple spoofing vulnerabilities, just like Petit Potam, but a bit more, it won't be able to exploit remotely, just locally. So if you're on a system, you will be able to exploit this if you're having local access to the system. But for one of those spoofing vulnerabilities, I have a surprise. I will demonstrate this to you right now and explain what the vulnerability actually involves. So the spoofing vulnerability lies within the Smart App Control feature within Windows, and it allows us as low-privileged user with access to a low-privileged user account to spoof ourselves to a system. But what is actually Smart App Control? Well, it was introduced as a new security feature in Windows 11. And basically what it does, when you try to run an app as a user that is not trusted or signed by a trusted party, it will just block that app from running. And its implementation is written within the crypt-cat service DLL, which is then loaded by the crypt service within Windows. It has one RPC interface, version 2.0. When I was fuzzing this RPC implementation, I could see that it was making these high privilege file operations for one of my fuzzing inputs. But what is actually a high privilege file operation in my case? Well, I wrote a rule that if the operation includes file and the user was a high privilege identity like anti-authority system or anti-authority network service, but it was not impersonating my low privilege user, or the other way around, where it was impersonating a high privilege user, but it was executed as my low privilege account, it will mark it as this high privilege file operation. And the procedure that has this operation is called ss get db send smart app control block those two. So the definition of this RPC procedure has 4 input parameters, where 3 are strings and 1 is an integer. And when we specify a remote UNC path for the first string input parameter, it will block up this toast message, which makes sense because the procedure includes a word called toast. And if you know or may not know, a toast message in Windows is just like your notification that you will see on the right side of the screen. But the interesting thing is, Smart App Control was definitely not on my system where I was fuzzing. So another thing that was interesting is that when I specified a remote UNC path in here and was listening on incoming NTLM authentication requests on the system that I specified the IP address from, I could see that high privilege identity NTLM authentication requests coming in. And of course, the network service account is not being used as identity to authenticate to remote systems, but rather the machine account is being used. So how can we actually abuse this to become system? Because now we only have this NTLM authentication request coming in on our listener. We want a way to abuse it or exploit it to do something with it. And a very familiar attack for such a exploit is using NTLM relay. And the concept of this is that you would send over this NTLM authentication request to the domain controller over, for example, LDAP, to obtain a authenticated session as that machine account over LDAP. And what you can then do, if you have a authenticated session as the machine account, you can modify attributes of that machine account in order to impersonate any system on that user, so also the domain administrator. There is one problem, and that is that our current remote UNC path sends the authentication request over SMB, but an SMB relaying to LDAP by default is not allowed. However, HTTP to LDAP is allowed. So what you can do, instead you specify a WebDAV path, which is a protocol over HTTP. And you will set up a remote port forward on the victim machine that will then send over the NTLM authentication request over HTTP to your attacker system. And now we can relay this authentication request to the domain controller and obtain a LDAP session. There's one downside, and that is that the Windows victim machine will need the web client service to be running in order to do this over WebDAV. But by default, Windows clients have this service available. You only have to start it in some cases. And the WebDAV path looks something like this, where we specify the port that is listening for incoming NTLM authentication requests, and then it sends over all the traffic to our attacker system. And now the authentication comes in from HTTP, and we can see that it is successfully connecting to the domain controller over LDAP. And I wrote a proof of concept for this. So on the right side, we can see a reverse shell setup on the victim machine, and on the left side, I have my remote system listening for incoming NTLM authentication request and relay it to the domain controller in order to get a authenticated LDAP session. And the proof of concept only takes one parameter, and that is the IP address of the remote system listening for incoming NTLM authentication requests. And you will see on the left what it does. It's modifying one of those attributes on the victim machine in order for us to impersonate any user on the victim machine, so also the domain controller. And now it has done that. I wrote a simple script which actually now creates a silver ticket for the administrator by using the credentials of the account that it created. So this account was set as user that could impersonate any user on the system. And what you will then see, I was able to obtain a system shell remotely. Okay, so, oh yeah, also including all the privileges. But there are a few downsides to this proof of concept, and that first of all you will require, or you will need a system on the internal network that will run in packet to do your NTLM authentication relaying. And also, when you have your silver ticket to impersonate any user, you will need the victim machine to have a port opened, for example SMB, to get a shell remotely. So a solution for this is that I modified DAV relay up, which uses actually petit potam to do all of this locally. And DAV relay up is like a chain of tools being used to do your whole attack chain of NTLM relay locally. So you will not need a remote system with in packet, or even a port opened for SMB, for example. So I modified DAV relay up to include my vulnerability within Smart App Control. And what you can actually see in this proof of concept is that it is popping up the toast message, but other than that, I get a shell system. Great. So, yeah, this actually works by default because, as I said, Smart App Control was definitely not on. So you can make this procedure call even if it is turned off. Now that we have those proof of concepts, some mitigations for it, because actually this is only vulnerable because NTLM of its NTLM implementation. And one way of mitigating these attacks is by setting LDAP channel binding and LDAP signing. And this is actually turned on by default from Windows Server 2025. And what you can also do is implement a group policy so that normal domain users on your domain will not be able to create a machine account which is required for our user to impersonate any user on that system. So, thank you very much for listening to my call. And if there are any questions, please let me know.
Hello?
Are there any questions? Was it all clear or not at all? Okay, well, if you have any questions, I will be here all day, so you can just ask them. Thank you.
Thank you, Remco. I hope you're going to spend your bug bounty well. Yeah. Congrats on that. Quick note for all the participants today. Due to the technical issues, we will give the technical personnel 15 minutes of time to try to fix everything. So feel free to take a break of 15 minutes. We will cut the next break a little bit shorter in this case. So feel free to roam around, be here back in 15 minutes. Thank you all.